So this session is about processing mainly. So yeah, GDAL should be in your toolkit anyway. And yeah, like Victor said, don't forget to also learn about the theories behind some of the data manipulation. Because the next speaker is Nuno Oliveira from GeoSolutions, and he will show us how you could do data manipulation basically in GeoServer. GeoServer is sort of becoming a complete GIS platform. So now the floor is to Nuno.
Thank you. Okay. So, hello, good morning. So, I am Nuno Oliveira. I am from GeoSolutions. I guess you already know who is GeoSolutions since we had several presentations. So, we are a company that works mainly with open source software. We have been developing and contributing to several GIS open source software, GeoServer, GeoNetwork, MapStore, etc. And our clients range from private clients to big public agencies. Okay, so, well, this presentation is about how we can overcome some of the limitations that exist with WMS. They are good limitations. They are for our own good, but sometimes we need to go beyond what they allow us to do. I mean, if you look in the perspective how things were done like 10 years ago, I mean, having the basic needs were pretty basic. Basically, need a way to show a map, to use some basic styling, to read some relational database, raster file. I mean, everything was pretty easy. Nowadays, things have changed a bit. We really need a lot more than that. I mean, we typically need to transformate, to change our data on the fly. We need to download large amounts of data with efficient and complex filtering over it. And, well, to overcome and to allow us to take some of these new requirements, the typical candidate for this is WPS. WPS is, well, Web Processing Service, is an OGC standard, and it basically allows us, well, to define some calculation that our server is capable to do. So this works pretty much like this. We describe a process. For example, if I want a process that will allow me to create a buffer around several geometries, so I describe what that process needs as an input and which outputs are available to it. Then the client will invoke a capabilities document. We'll know the list of available processes on the server, and then it can do can perform a describe process against the server, and it will know how to invoke that specific calculation, and then it will invoke that calculation and get the result back. Very simple. Okay, so this is an example, a very simple example. So here I'm invoking a buffer process, so I pass as an input a simple geometry, and then I ask him to create me a buffer around it. So when things start to get interesting is that we can chain several things like this together. So the input in this case could actually come from another WFS server. The output of this could actually go to another process. For example, I could use the buffer process to create a buffer around certain geometries and then have a clip process which will use this output to clip the geometries. This could be, for example, used to limit restricted areas. So another advantage of WPS is that we can use asynchronous call. I mean, if we have been developing web application, you know that nowadays that's a pretty common architecture, and it's quite a useful thing to have, to be able to invoke something and, well, let it run on the server and then check from times to times what is the status, and when it's done, get the result back. Okay, so this is a common WPS setup, so nothing very special about it. So, well, we have some inputs that can be remote servers, a WCS, a WFS, or an HTTP server that can return some data. The WPS process will consume it, and then we'll give it back to the client after applying the process on it. So the GeoServer implementation is a bit more complex and allows us to do a few more interesting things. So first of all, WPS is not the core of your server, which means that, well, it's something that is useful but not used by all of the people, which means that is an extension that you need to explicitly install, okay? So WPS in GeoServer allow you not only to, of course, use the normal stuff, so get data from remote locations, etc., but will also allow you to directly invoke the layers available in GeoServer, meaning that we can take advantage of all the data stores supported by GeoServer and the performance improvements that were implemented for it. Another big advantage is the ability to use WPS process directly in the styling definition as a rendering transformation, which provides a direct integration with WMS, which means that you can do normal WMS queries, and in the style we define in the SLD, we can define the invocation of WPS process to transform our data on the fly. And all of this will take advantage of the locality of the data, and it will be very efficient. Another advantage is the GeoServer UI. So the GeoServer UI gives you a basic client that, well, will help you to test out some process, to chain them together, and etc. And, well, as I say, we have the rendering transformation. So we'll see concrete example of this later, but basically rendering transformations allow us to, well, when I have a style, okay, I have points, but I actually need lines. So I invoke some WPS process that will convert those dots to lines, and this will be done on the fly and using to renderize the final image. Okay, so WPS is nice, but sometimes is a bit too much. Most of the data we have of course, if you are working with vector data, is in spatial database. So we have relational capabilities. And one thing relational databases are good to is, well, relating data together, of course, but also grouping, aggregating, and doing some more, let's say, computations over it. Another advantage is, I mean, if you have, let's say, recently there is all the discussion about big data and so on, but one of the advantages of being able to push the computation to the data is that we can take advantage of that locality. So if we can say directly in the database, this is what I am interested in, it will make everything more performant, because we'll not need to get data back to the server, work on it. We'll basically just get what we need directly from the source. So in GeoServer, you can do something which is named SQL views, which are not really SQL views, so bad naming, I guess. Is basically, it's all used to define on the UI a query that will be used to get the data you need, and then you can create that as a vector layer. So you can also do a bit more than that. You can also make it dynamic to provide some parameters, okay? For example, this is using a vendor parameter called view params, when you can pass some input to your OSGeo query that will be sent to the database. I will show more concrete examples of this in the end. This is, for example, the example of a query. So this use case, we have several storm locations, okay? And basically, we want to sort them, and want to build a line with all the storm locations, okay? So this is done with this query. So basically, we define a layer saying this is what we are interested in, this is our universe, and so everything, when GeoServer will look at that layer, it will implicitly use this query behind the scenes, okay? As you can see, we have several parameters to make it dynamic, like the mean observation here, the max observation here, and so in a transparent way, this query will be sent to the database, it will produce the data we need, and then GeoServer will use it in a normal way, in WFS or WMS or whatever other OGC protocol we are using. Okay, so now I will go through some examples that will show the usage of these technologies. So the first one is a use case where this we're using to do some precision agriculture with Sentinel-2 data. So basically, you want to take an image and you want to be a raster file from Sentinel in this case, and we want to be able to create some specific visualization where there is a code color that will be respected, that will allow us to better understand the status of the vegetation. When you have a raster file, typically we have multiple bands. In the Sentinel-2 rasters, we have 13 bands. When you see an image like this, we are usually using 3 bands to draw the RGB colors. It may be different, it depends on the use case, but my point is you usually only use a small number of bands. This is the output we want to obtain in this case, okay? So we'll only need 2 bands to combine 2 bands values, and when basically, so red means the vegetation is not in a good state, green means the vegetation is a really good state, and purple, pink means water, okay? So pretty basic stuff. The interesting part here is how we do that. So we do this with a raster transformation. With a raster transformation, we do this with an SLD using a transformation function. In this case, the transformation function is the GFL transformation function, which allows us to do raster algebra using a specific scripting language. So it pretty much looks like this, okay? So this is a normal SLD, and then we can see at line 14 that we use a function, in this case the GFL function, okay? This is behind the scenes a WPS process, okay? And what it does here is basically we provide the script where we say we need to combine the band number 8 and the band number 3, and then we obtain the result we need. Bands are 0 based, okay? So this is a normal SLD we define in GeoServer, and then using WMS we can query GeoServer saying that we want this specific style, and the data will be changed on the fly, okay, and we'll get the image we are expecting. So we don't need to use some crazy, let's say, imaging processing. This will be a normal setup with image mosaic that will have the Sentinel data, and we can use styling to get the data rendering in the way we want. Okay, so this is a use case where we use only SQL views to handle it. So basically we have a database with a lot of data about tuna locations. And now we are using those tuna resources. And basically we wanted to show that data aggregated over time, okay? So a SQL query was used to do the grouping on the database directly. I mean, we can all see the advantage of that. So we don't need to push everything to the server, do the aggregation on the server, and then show the results. We basically ask the database to do that for us, and we get directly the results we need. So what we needed there is to show the, let's say, these aggregations over time. So we also add the necessity of doing an animation, in this case with a GIF or GIF. And so we used a WPS process to that, okay, where you can send several parameters. You ask the server to build the GIF for you, and it will return you that animation. So another use case in this case is to basically, if you are being using WFS and WCS or another protocol that allows you to download data, is that sometimes the data is too big. And in a user perspective, waiting for the server to download the data is not the best thing ever. So we can use a WPS to overcome that limitation. We can have a synchronous call, and we can do a bit more than this. Sometimes having a bounding box, for example, in a WMS query is not enough. We actually need to clip the polygon. So for example, if you invoke a WMS service with a bounding box, and the bounding box is over, let's say, a building, if there is some restrictions, areas or something, you can actually see that polygon code clipping, okay? So there is several processes already available in GeoServer that will allow you to do that. This is an example with an actual UI, in this case map store, okay, where basically the user can say, okay, create me a buffer over this restricted area, and then use it to download it in an asynchronous way, the data from the server, with all the geometries clipped inside the restricted area, okay? So this is pretty much how it works. So you have a synchronous calls to the server using WFS, and you get the data in a nice way. Okay, so this one is a more advanced use case, is that sometimes you want to use WPS remote. This is not something everyone will typically need to use. It is mainly the ability to invoke remotely other WPS process, okay? So behind the scene, this is using a protocol named XMPP, so XMPP actually, which means that GeoServer and the remote WPS will basically be having a chat. I need this, I need that, please give it to me, and so on. If you use Python, I mean, this will not be strange to you. Anyway, this is a capability that I've been implementing in GeoServer. Is still in progress with some fixes coming in. Okay, so this was for the remote. This is a very interesting project. Okay, so this is a project, its name is Destination Project, where basically we have, let's say, the road structures. This was for northern Italy and south of Switzerland. And basically we wanted to assess, let's say, the risk of building some structures around the road. So for example, if you need to build an hospital, okay, we want to assess what is the probability in that road that will be an accident involving chemical transportations and so on. So as you may be thinking, this is not something you can do with WMS, with WFS. Number one, we have a lot of data to process, so this is not something you can do in a synchronous way. And of course, you need to do a lot of processing. So the data is basically provided in several segments. We have 500,000 segments, and then for each segment, we'll need to assess a certain risk. For example, if I have a truck that is carrying some specific chemical, we'll need to go to each portion of the road we have, check the stats, the probability of an accident, assess the probability of that accident, and then compare with the infrastructures around. Okay, so the formulas were quite complex, so this means that at some moment the performance was not there. We had to bring some of these computations directly to the database, so we are actually mixing WPS with SQL views query to compute directly the aggregations on the database. And the results looks pretty much like this. So this we have a road structure. Basically, in this case, you ask, okay, what is the probability to have a certain accident in certain area, and we'll get the road painted according to that. As I say, we had really to bring the computations to the database because at some moment there was just too many data to bring to the server. You cannot bring 500,000 segments to GeoServer and do the aggregation there, so you have to do it directly on the source. So for doing this, we used some parametric queries. So we had several SQL views that implemented the necessary computation, and then, well, we are passing the values we need dependent on the inputs that were provided to the WPS process. Okay, and then we had, of course, the rendering was quite efficient because, I mean, we had to use some rendering transformations to, let's say, compute the data on the fly because we could not create all the geometries on the database on the fly. So this use case uses basically everything. It uses SQL view, WPS process, and rendering transformations. Okay, this is another part of the use case, as I say, is to assess, okay, so I know these roads, I know the probabilities of having an accident. Okay, I take 3 trucks passing there, and if I build this structure there, what will be the risk that structure will have? What will be the best position for it, and so on. SQL views again. This is another use case where we can use, I mean, a lot of use cases were under using this, okay? So this is another project, and it's the last one. So this project is basically to assess the risk on mammals, marine mammals, about acoustic transmissions. So again, we had to use pretty much everything. The different thing here is that we had actually some, let's say, quite advanced computations that needed to be done with Octave MATLAB script. So we had to do really numerical calculus. So this is another nice thing about WPS, is that you can really connect to whatever you need. In this case, it was a completely different product. And is more of the same. So basically, we have data to process. We use WPS, let's say, to overcome the limitations of WMS, WFS to do the computations we need. When needed, we basically use, let's say, a transformation to do some raster algebra on the fly when you are doing the style. Again, using the GFL language that you may know. It's basically a scripty language specific for these use cases. And nice thing about GFL in GeoServer is that, of course, for this to use well, it needs to be transparent to the user, all the questions like performance, which means that GeoServer will look at your script, will understand which bands you need, and will only read those bands from your raster files, which will make a huge performance improvement. And then And that's okay for the raster algebra, so there is several examples of it going on. Then we have again, this is actually an interesting slide. It shows how WPS can be used to do tasks that are not that normal. For example, I need to clean something from time to times. So I may have, and it will be the client will trigger in some way, so I can implement a process that will be invoked by the client to do that specific utility need. It's not a very orthodox way of doing, but it will do the work. And that's all. Questions?
Yes, thank you very much, Nuno. Yes, we have ample time for some questions. Is the microphone can be passed? Okay.
In one of your slides, you showed that WPS server can fetch data from several input sources. For example, if I send a WPS request, the WPS server goes and getting this data from, I don't know, HTTPS server. There are some sources from where the WPS can get the data. Can it also handle, I mean, if the source is protected by some authentication, for example, username and password or SSH? Because I have encountered a case where I need to get a data, I use an input data for WPS, but this input is protected. I have the credentials, but I couldn't find a way how to use that, how to make WPS use that credentials to fetch the data. Is there anything available in GeoServer?
Okay, that's a good question. So if I understood it correctly, it was basically, I want to invoke some remote data store, and of course it needs authentication. How can I do it? So, well, directly, you cannot do it without development process, because one of the things about WPS is that you can develop your own, and then you'll be free to do everything you need. So you can, for example, for Apache Solar, I think you can say, well, I will develop my specific input for this WPS process. Okay, we'll take care of doing all the login and retrieve the data the way I need, and then we'll be free to go. Of course, you will need to do development work. So another option is that if there is a data store in GeoServer that allow you to query already that specific data store, for example, in this case, Apache Solar, there is one, well, you can create that data store in GeoServer, provide the credential there, and then ask WPS to use that data store, okay? Of course, I mean, you will be limited to the usual protocol. So you get, let's say, the simple features. You will not be able, for example, to query complex features at the moment, I think. So there is several ways of doing it.
But the standard itself has no method of putting authentication details or in the WPS request.
Yes, by default, WPS will not use authentication. So at this moment, using the default process in GeoServer, as far as I know, there is no way to say, okay, connect to this specific source and use these credentials.
Okay.
You cannot do that. You have to create the data stores in GeoServer or develop your own input source.
All right, thank you.
I mean, but that's something that could be improved, of course. I mean, there is always, let's say, room for improvement. With the correct funding and correct interest, that's something that could be done.
Hello. I think you should use a proxy for that locally in your server. Make a proxy for passing the authentication to the URL you want to fetch the data.
Yes.
Okay?
That's another valid.
Yes, of course. Another question. You mentioned that WPS calls in the SLD styles. Can we use WPS processing in CSS styling, GeoCSS?
Okay, so just saying before, basically the proxy example is a valid example, of course, but anything that will allow you, let's say, I make a call to the network and will do the login for you, will work, okay? So, answer your question, that's a good question. Can transformation be used in a CSS? Yes, I think so. So, I'm not sure, when you mean CSS, you mean, let's say, the alternative to SLD, right?
Yes, that we saw yesterday, yes. I think.
Yeah, transformation.
That was much simpler.
Yes, I mean, CSS is, let's say, more compact than SLD, yes. So usually all these languages that exist, let's say in GeoServer, CSS and Mapbox styles and so on, they will later be translated to the SLD, okay? So everything SLD supports can be supported there too. Sometimes it may be that the person who implemented that specific style format didn't implement that conversion. But as far as I know, CSC and Epson SLD also support it.
Okay.
There's time for one last question. If not, then again, thanks to Nuno Oliveira. And okay, so we already heard now about WPS, Web Processing Service, an important standard.